On a quiet weekend afternoon in 1999, a 4-year-old boy vanished from Maple Grove Park in Riverton. He did not wander into the woods. He did not walk home. He disappeared from a place where parents were sitting only a short distance away. What followed was not an immediate answer, but weeks of waiting, and a question that refused to settle. How can someone disappear where everyone believes nothing can happen? Riverton had long been described as a quiet, suburban city. Not because anything remarkable happened there, but because nothing ever seemed to interrupt its rhythm. Days followed familiar patterns. People left for work at predictable hours, returned home before dusk, and spent weekends in places they had visited many times before. Safety was not something discussed often. It was assumed. For families raising young children, Riverton felt steady, orderly, and free of urgency. Maple Grove Park was one of those places that reinforced that belief. It sat between residential streets, open on all sides, without fences or gates to suggest separation from the neighborhood around it. There were no cameras mounted on poles, no warning signs posted at the entrances. The park did not present itself as secure. It simply existed as it always had. Families came there every week, often at the same hours, sitting on the same benches, watching their children move through the same small spaces. For Helen and Richard Bennett, Maple Grove Park was part of a routine they trusted. Helen worked as an administrative assistant, a job that shaped the way she approached daily life. She believed in schedules, in order, in habits that reduced uncertainty. Richard worked in systems maintenance, spending his days observing how things functioned, noticing details without drawing attention to them. He was not a suspicious man, but he had developed the habit of quietly taking in his surroundings. Together, they built a life that valued predictability. Their son, Noah, was 4 years old. He was a child who rarely demanded notice. His voice was soft, his words deliberate, often arriving more slowly than those of other children his age. When surrounded by noise, he tended to withdraw rather than compete with it. He liked objects that behaved consistently. Small toy cars, especially those with wheels that turned smoothly, could hold his attention for long stretches of time. He would sit and spin them, watching the movement repeat itself, calm and absorbed. Most days, Noah wore a light gray knit hat. It was not chosen for fashion or warmth. It was simply familiar, and familiarity gave him comfort. On a weekend afternoon, the Bennetts arrived at Maple Grove Park, as they often did. The day carried the quiet feeling of late autumn. The air was cool, but not uncomfortable, and the trees surrounding the park had begun to thin, their leaves gathering along the edges of the paths. The park was active, but unremarkable. A handful of families were already there. Children moved between the slide and the open grass, their voices blending into a steady background sound. Adults sat nearby, watching without concern. Noah played close to his parents. He stayed near the bench where Helen and Richard sat, moving back and forth between it and the low play structure a short distance away. From where they were seated, they could see him clearly. His small figure was easy to recognize, especially with the gray hat pulled low over his head. Helen watched him with the quiet confidence of a parent who had seen the same scene unfold many times before. Richard observed without staring, his attention shifting naturally between his son and the surrounding park. At one point, Noah crouched near the wooden bench, focused on a small toy car he had brought with him. He rolled it along the surface of the wood, guiding it carefully. When the car slipped from his hand and fell beneath the bench, he followed it without hesitation. He retrieved it, stood up, and brushed his hands against his pants. After that, he moved a few steps farther away, toward the area near the slide. From the bench, he was still visible. Nothing about the moment felt unusual. The afternoon continued without interruption. Conversations carried on around the park. A child laughed nearby. Someone called out a name from across the grass. Time passed in a way that felt slow and unimportant. When Helen looked up again, Noah was no longer where she expected him to be. At first, the absence did not register as alarm. She scanned the area near the slide, then the open space beyond it, assuming he had wandered slightly out of her direct line of sight. She stood, taking a few steps forward, calling his name in a calm voice. Richard rose from the bench and looked in the opposite direction, expecting to see Noah just beyond the cluster of children. They walked a short distance, still confident they would spot him within seconds. Helen circled back toward the bench. Richard checked near the path leading toward the trees. Noah did not appear. Helen called his name again, louder this time, and paused, listening. There was no response. The feeling in the park changed gradually. It did not arrive with a sharp sound or sudden movement. It came in the form of small adjustments. Helen's voice carried farther than before. Richard's steps became quicker. Other parents noticed and turned their attention toward the Bennetts, sensing that something was wrong even before it was explained. Helen told them they could not find their son. The words were simple, spoken without panic, but they altered the mood of the space. A few adults stood and began to look around. Children were gathered closer to their parents. The open park felt larger, its boundaries less clear. Under the bench where Noah had been playing earlier, the small toy car lay on its side, partially hidden by fallen leaves. It looked untouched, exactly where it had landed. The gray knit hat Noah usually wore was not nearby. No one remembered seeing him remove it. No one remembered seeing him walk away with it. People searched the immediate area, moving toward the edges of the park, scanning the paths that led away from it. Names were called, softly at first, then louder. The space offered no clear direction. There were no sounds to follow, no movement to trace. Everything around them looked the same as it had an hour earlier. As the search continued, one detail surfaced quietly. A woman who had been walking her dog near the park's side entrance mentioned that she had seen a man earlier in the afternoon wearing festive clothing. She could not recall his face clearly, only that the outfit stood out against the muted colors of the season. She remembered him passing near the side gate, moving at a normal pace. At the time, the sight had not seemed important. She had not stopped to watch him. She could not say where he went afterward. The detail did not bring clarity. It did not explain what had happened. It simply added another unanswered question to the afternoon. As the light shifted and shadows lengthened across the grass, the park no longer felt like a place meant for rest. The benches, the slide, the open paths remained unchanged, but the sense of ease that once defined the space had faded. The moment Noah Bennett was last seen did not announce itself. It left no mark, no sound, no clear memory that could be held on to. What remained was absence, settling quietly into a place that had once felt entirely safe. The afternoon at Maple Grove Park did not end with an answer. As daylight faded and the space emptied, the absence that had taken shape there did not disperse with the people who left. It followed Helen and Richard Bennett home, settling into the house with a quiet persistence. By the next morning, the rhythm of Riverton had shifted just enough to be noticeable. The first organized response began early the following day. Responsibility for the case was assigned to Inspector Paul Mercer of the Riverton Police Department. Mercer had spent most of his career working in a city that rarely demanded urgency from him. He was known among colleagues for his measured approach. He spoke little, carried a small notebook rather than a digital device, and preferred to observe before offering conclusions. Those who worked with him described him as someone who trusted sequence more than instinct. Mercer's first visit to Maple Grove Park took place before noon. The area was temporarily closed to regular foot traffic, not with barriers or warning signs, but through quiet presence. Officers stood at the entrances, guiding visitors away and asking them to return later. The park itself looked unchanged. Benches remained in place. The play structure stood untouched. Leaves continued to collect along the paths. Nothing about the setting suggested what had occurred there the day before. The initial focus was simple and methodical. Mercer walked the park slowly, noting distances between benches, paths, and exits. He marked where Noah Bennett had last been seen and traced the most likely directions a small child might have taken if moving on his own. Each observation was written down, not interpreted. The goal was not to explain the absence, but to understand the space in which it had happened. A list of people present at the park that afternoon was assembled using interviews conducted by officers who had returned to the neighborhood. Parents, dog walkers, and regular visitors were contacted again, this time with more structured questions. Where they had been sitting, what time they arrived, when they left, whether they remembered any unfamiliar faces. Most answers were uncertain. Memories blurred quickly when asked to recall an ordinary afternoon that had only later taken on meaning. In parallel, records were reviewed for individuals in the area with a history of inappropriate attention toward children. The process was quiet and procedural, carried out without public announcement. Names were checked, addresses confirmed, and movements reviewed where possible. Nothing immediate stood out. No single person fit the available details with enough clarity to draw attention. While these early steps unfolded, the Bennett family moved in their own way. Helen printed notices with Noah's photograph and basic information, keeping the language simple and factual. She taped them to store windows, telephone poles, and community boards, returning to places she passed each day to check whether they were still there. Richard walked through nearby streets, knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they had seen a small boy wearing a gray knit hat. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Polite concern, an offer to help, no new information. Every call received by the family was logged. Helen wrote down times and brief notes, even when the call led nowhere. The act of recording felt like a way to impose order on something that had none. Richard checked the phone repeatedly, answering numbers he did not recognize, hoping for a voice that might bring clarity. Most calls were expressions of support. A few were mistaken sightings that could not be confirmed. As the days passed, local media began to report on the situation. The coverage was cautious. Headlines avoided dramatic language. Articles referred to Noah as a child who had not returned home after an afternoon at the park. The possibility that he had wandered away was mentioned often, presented as the most likely explanation. The tone reflected the city's reluctance to imagine something more troubling. Inspector Mercer paid close attention to how information circulated. He noted which details were repeated and which were omitted. Public messaging remained limited, focusing on physical description and last known location. No assumptions were shared. The absence of definitive language left space for hope, but it also prolonged uncertainty. On the fifth day, a maintenance worker, responsible for groundskeeping at Maple Grove Park, requested to speak with officers. He had not come forward earlier because, at the time, he had believed what he saw was ordinary. While reviewing the park schedule, he remembered a vehicle parked briefly along the service road near the trees on the afternoon Noah disappeared. It was positioned close enough to the park to be noticed, but not close enough to raise concern. The worker could not recall the make or model, only that it did not belong to any of the regular visitors he recognized. The detail was recorded without emphasis. It did not point in a clear direction. It did, however, introduce a new element that had not been accounted for before. A vehicle that did not belong. A moment that had seemed unimportant until placed beside others. Mercer added the note to his file and continued reviewing the timeline. The sequence remained incomplete. Noah had been visible. Then he had not. Everything between those 2 points remained undefined. At home, the Bennett household adjusted to a new pattern. Helen kept Noah's room as it was, the bed neatly made, the door left slightly open. Richard continued his door-to-door visits, expanding his range a little each day. Neighbors began to recognize him, greeting him before he spoke. Conversations grew shorter as days passed without progress. By the end of the first week, the search had taken on a quieter tone. Efforts continued, but without the urgency that marked the first days. The park reopened. Children returned. Life in Riverton resumed its usual pace, though not without awareness. Parents watched a little more closely. Conversations lingered on the subject a little longer than before. Inspector Mercer reviewed his notes each evening, reading them in order, resisting the impulse to rearrange them into a narrative. The case, at this stage, offered no story to tell. Only fragments. Only time. As the city moved forward, the early search settled into a waiting period. What had begun as an ordinary afternoon had become an open question, one that remained unanswered, even as the days continued to pass. As November gave way to December, the city of Riverton slowly returned to its usual pace. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Streets filled again at familiar hours. Children returned to school routines. Maple Grove Park reopened, and by the second week, the benches were once again occupied by families who had not been there on the afternoon Noah Bennett disappeared. The place looked unchanged, yet for those who remembered, something about it felt unsettled. The search did not stop, but it lost its earlier intensity. What had begun with urgency now moved by schedule. Information was reviewed, then reviewed again. Not because something new had appeared, but because nothing had. Inspector Paul Mercer continued to keep the file active, though the entries grew shorter. Dates, names, and brief notes filled the pages of his notebook, recorded in untold, the same steady handwriting. The sequence remained incomplete. There was still no clear explanation for the moment Noah was last seen. For the Bennett family, time took on a different shape. Days no longer passed as units marked by tasks completed or appointments kept. They passed as stretches of waiting, broken only by phone calls that led nowhere. Helen continued to place notices in shop windows, replacing those that had been removed by weather or routine cleaning. Each time she did, she adjusted the tape carefully, as if the act itself mattered. Richard extended his walks farther from their home, following paths he had never taken before, knocking on doors where no one recognized his face. At home, Noah's room remained unchanged. The gray knit hat he usually wore was not there. Helen kept a small lamp on in the hallway at night, a habit she could not explain but did not question. Richard checked the phone before sleeping, and again before leaving for work each morning. The absence of news became its own presence, filling conversations and silences alike. In the wider community, attention softened. The local paper continued to mention Noah's name, but the articles grew shorter and were placed deeper within the pages. The language remained cautious, avoiding conclusions. Conversations at grocery stores and school pickup lines still returned to the same question, but less often than before. People wanted to believe that an answer would come on its own. Inspector Mercer noted the change in tone. He understood it as part of a familiar pattern. Cases without clear direction often slipped into a holding state, neither active nor closed. He resisted labeling it as such, but he could not ignore the reality of limited movement. each potential lead had been checked and found inconclusive. Each possibility remained hypothetical. During the third week, a small detail resurfaced in an unexpected way. While reviewing community photographs from a neighborhood event held earlier in the year, an officer noticed an image that had not drawn attention before. It showed a man dressed in festive clothing, posing near a motorcycle with a side-mounted compartment, smiling beside children who appeared relaxed and unafraid. The photograph had been taken months earlier and had circulated without comment at the time. Now, viewed alongside other fragments, it carried a different weight. The image did not provide answers. It did not place anyone at Maple Grove Park on the afternoon Noah disappeared. It did, however, introduce a visual that lingered, a familiar costume, a presence designed to appear harmless. Mercer noted it without emphasis, placing it among other details that did not yet connect. For Helen, December arrived quietly. Decorations appeared in shop windows along the main street. Music played softly in places where it always did at this time of year. The contrast between the season and her own sense of waiting felt sharp, though she rarely spoke of it. She attended work as usual, completed her tasks, and returned home at the same hour each evening. Routine became a way to move through days that no longer followed a natural rhythm. Richard's conversations with neighbors changed as well. Early concern gave way to careful distance, not out of indifference, but uncertainty. People no longer knew what to say. Offers of help became less specific. Still, a few continued to check in, asking quietly whether there had been any word. By the 38th day, the case file contained no new developments. The timeline remained fixed. The afternoon at Maple Grove Park stood alone, separated from the present by weeks of unanswered questions. Inspector Mercer reviewed his notes again, reading them in order, resisting the urge to draw conclusions not supported by sequence. He knew that cases like this often waited for an external disruption, something that arrived from outside the established frame. For the Bennett family, the passage of time did not bring resolution. It brought endurance. Helen folded Noah's clothes and placed them back where they belonged. Richard continued his walks, though now he spoke less during them. Both held on to the possibility that the silence did not mean finality, only delay. As December moved forward, Riverton prepared for the end of the year. Streets were lit. Stores extended their hours. Families gathered in familiar ways. Somewhere within that movement, a question remained unanswered, suspended between what was known and what had yet to surface. The file stayed open. The waiting continued. And without anyone realizing it, the quiet stretch that defined those 38 days was nearing its end. December 18th arrived quietly in Riverton, wrapped in the soft signals of the approaching holiday. Streets carried modest decorations. Shop windows reflected warm light onto dark sidewalks. People moved through the evening with familiar purpose, focused on routine rather than expectation. Nothing about the night suggested it would carry consequences beyond its own hours. For the Hale family, the evening unfolded without urgency. Thomas Hale had finished work later than usual, and Christine Hale suggested stopping briefly for fuel before heading home. Their daughter, Lily, sat in the back seat, distracted by passing lights and the promise of home. The stop at Crossway Fuel Stop was meant to be brief, a pause between one place and another. The station stood just off Old River Highway, brightly lit against the surrounding darkness. A few vehicles came and went. The air was cold, still, and ordinary. While Thomas stood near the pump, Lily stepped out of the car and lingered close by. It was then that she noticed a man standing several yards away, dressed in festive clothing that contrasted sharply with the muted tones of the night. Beside him was a motorcycle, parked carefully, fitted with a side-mounted compartment. Inside that compartment sat a large stuffed reindeer, positioned, to be seen. The man spoke casually, smiling as he gestured toward the reindeer. His voice carried the practiced ease of someone accustomed to attention. Lily moved a few steps closer, curious but not rushed. From a distance, the moment appeared harmless, seasonal, unremarkable. Christine noticed and called out to Lily, reminding her to stay near the car. The man lifted a hand in brief acknowledgement, still smiling, still unhurried. The change came without warning. The motorcycle engine started, its sound cutting through the stillness. Before either parent could react fully, the motorcycle began to move, pulling away from the pump area and toward the highway. Lily was no longer standing beside the car. Thomas reacted instinctively. He returned to his vehicle, started the engine, and followed. Christine remained behind with the car, calling emergency services as she watched the taillight disappear down Old River Highway. The pursuit that followed was short, defined less by distance than by urgency. Traffic was light. The motorcycle remained visible ahead, its path steady rather than evasive. The motorcycle turned abruptly into the parking lot of St. Luke's Community Church, slowing to a stop beneath the glow of overhead lights. Thomas followed and positioned his car in a way that blocked the exit. He stepped out, keeping his movements controlled. The man on the motorcycle did not attempt to leave. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Lily was returned without resistance. Thomas took her from the side-mounted compartment and held her close, speaking to her quietly while checking for any sign of harm. Moments later, Christine arrived, wrapping Lily in a blanket and holding her as if to confirm that the moment had passed. No further explanation followed. The family did not question him. They did not attempt to interpret his words. Once Lily was safely in their care, the situation was turned over to responding officers. Statements were taken. The sequence of events was recorded. The motorcycle was secured. The man identified himself as Edgar Vaughn, 56 years old. He appeared unsteady, his speech slightly slurred, his focus inconsistent. Officers noted the smell of alcohol. He was cooperative, though his answers drifted, circling back to the same phrases without adding clarity. Later that evening, Vaughn was brought in for questioning. The setting was controlled and quiet. There were no raised voices, no immediate accusations. His condition was noted. He had been drinking. That fact shaped the pace and tone of the conversation. During the interview, Vaughn spoke freely but imprecisely. He returned repeatedly to the idea that his actions were familiar, even welcomed. He talked about appearances he had made in festive clothing, about children who smiled and posed for photographs. At times, his comments seemed disconnected from the questions being asked. At other moments, they lingered on details that did not quite fit the incident at the fuel station. He mentioned places. He mentioned giving rides. He mentioned a child who liked to sit quietly. None of it formed a clear statement. There was no direct admission. What emerged instead was a pattern of behavior described without awareness of its implications. Investigators listened, recorded, and did not interrupt. As the interview continued, certain phrases stood out. Vaughn spoke of a boy who preferred to be alone. He mentioned a gray hat, then dismissed the thought as unimportant. The comments were brief, easily overlooked, yet they shifted the attention in the room. The tone changed, not outwardly, but in focus. By the end of the session, Vaughn's words had not answered the immediate questions. They had, however, introduced the possibility that the incident involving Lily Hale did not exist in isolation. The references he made, unclear and unprompted, aligned too closely with details from another file to be ignored. That night, 2 records were placed side by side for the first time. One concerned a child who had been returned to her family after a brief encounter. The other documented a boy who had not come home from Maple Grove Park 38 days earlier. No conclusions were drawn yet. No statements were made publicly. The connection existed only as a working consideration, a quiet shift in perspective prompted not by evidence alone, but by words spoken without caution. The night ended without resolution. But it did not end the silence. It marked the moment when waiting gave way to renewed attention, and when an event that appeared complete began to open outward, toward a question that had remained unanswered for weeks. The hours following the interview did not bring immediate answers. What they brought instead was a shift in attention. The incident involving Lily Hale had been documented, contained, and, on the surface, resolved. Yet the words spoken by Edgar Vaughn during questioning lingered beyond their immediate context. They did not stand on their own. They pointed outward, toward something that had already been waiting. Inspector Paul Mercer reviewed the recording the next morning, listening without interruption. He did not search for emphasis or tone. He focused on sequence. Vaughn's statements moved in circles, returning repeatedly to familiar ideas, appearances, rides, children who smiled, places he had visited more than once. None of it formed a clear account. What mattered was not what Vaughn explained, but what he mentioned without being asked. Mercer retrieved the file that had remained open for 38 days, the one marked with Noah Bennett's name. Until that point, the two records had existed in parallel, separated by circumstance and time. Now, placed beside each other, they invited comparison. Mercer did not assume a connection. He allowed the details to speak in their own order. He began with timelines. Vaughn's movements over the past 2 months were mapped using receipts, witness, statements, and routine patterns. His schedule revealed a familiarity with community spaces, parks, small events, roadside stops, places where children were present without formal supervision. Several of those locations fell within short driving distance of Maple Grove Park. None overlapped precisely with the afternoon Noah disappeared, but the proximity was notable. Next came behavior. Vaughn had described his actions as habitual. He spoke of them as something he had done before, not once, but repeatedly. Photographs recovered from community boards and informal gatherings supported this. In image after image, he appeared in festive clothing, standing beside his motorcycle, children smiling nearby. The side-mounted compartment was visible in several of them. In none did the children appear distressed. That detail complicated interpretation rather than clarifying it. Mercer returned to his notes from the Bennett case. Noah's preference for quiet play, his gray knit hat, the absence of noise or urgency at the park, the lack of witnesses who could describe a sudden change. When Vaughn had mentioned a child who liked to sit quietly, it had been delivered without context, as if recalling something ordinary. When he mentioned a gray hat, it had passed quickly, almost dismissed. Those fragments did not prove anything. They did, however, align in ways that could not be ignored. A decision was made to expand the review. Vaughn's residence was examined with care, not as a conclusion, but as a step. The space revealed little at first glance. It was orderly, sparse, and unremarkable. But attention to detail produced results. Items that did not belong to an adult living alone. Small objects tucked away rather than displayed. A child's glove, mismatched. A book meant for early readers, and folded carefully inside a drawer. A light gray knit hat. The discovery was documented without commentary. No immediate conclusions were drawn. The hat was similar to many sold in stores, indistinct in design. Yet its presence shifted the weight of the review. The item was cataloged, photographed, and set aside for further comparison. Meanwhile, Mercer returned to Maple Grove Park. This time he walked it with a different lens. He stood where Noah had last been seen and traced possible paths outward, considering not only where a child might wander, but where an adult might stand without drawing attention. The side entrance came into focus. It was less visible from the main area, partially obscured by trees. A vehicle parked briefly along the service road there would not have stood out. The maintenance worker who had mentioned the unfamiliar vehicle was contacted again. This time, he recalled a bit more. The vehicle had been positioned close to the trees, angled toward the road as if prepared to leave quickly. He still could not recall details, but the placement matched the possibility Mercer was now considering. Back at the station, the review expanded to include reports from nearby neighborhoods. Quiet inquiries were made. Had anyone seen Vaughn in festive clothing in late November? Had anyone noticed his motorcycle near community spaces during that period? Responses were uneven. Some remembered him vaguely. Others did not. A few mentioned seeing him near a park around that time, though dates were uncertain. The process was slow by design. Mercer avoided moving faster than the information allowed. He understood the risk of forcing alignment where none existed. Yet, with each comparison, the separation between the two files narrowed. For Helen and Richard Bennett, communication remained limited. They were informed that the review of Noah's case had been expanded, but not told why. Details were withheld, not to protect an investigation, but to avoid raising expectations prematurely. Helen continued her routines. Richard continued his walks. The waiting persisted, now shaped by the knowledge that something had changed, even if its shape remained unclear. As the days progressed, Vaughn was interviewed again, this time after he had regained clarity. His tone was more guarded. The casual flow of words seen earlier gave way to shorter answers. He did not repeat the same unprompted details. When asked about specific places, he hesitated. When asked about children he had met, he deflected. The contrast between his two accounts did not provide confirmation. It did, however, reinforce the value of the earlier statements. Words spoken without caution had offered more than those delivered with restraint. By the end of the week, Mercer documented the shift formally. The Bennett case was no longer treated as a standalone absence. It was now part of a broader review involving Vaughn's activities over the preceding months. The language remained careful. No conclusions were stated, only connections under consideration. Two files that had once existed apart now shared a working space. The silence that had defined the past 38 days had not been broken by certainty, but it had been disturbed by pattern. For the first time since Noah Bennett disappeared, the question was no longer whether something would surface, but when. And in the quiet order of the station, the work continued, guided not by urgency, but by the steady accumulation of detail. Once the two files were formally linked, the pace of work changed, not in speed, but in direction. The review surrounding Edgar Vaughn moved from comparison to confirmation. What had previously been treated as possibility now required structure. Each step needed to stand on its own, independent of suggestion or assumption. Inspector Paul Mercer was careful about this transition. He understood that connections, once stated too early, could weaken rather than strengthen a case. Authorization was obtained to conduct a more thorough examination of Vaughn's property and personal effects. The process unfolded over several days, methodical and restrained. Nothing was rushed. Each item was documented in place before being removed. The aim was not discovery through force, but clarity through sequence. The residence itself offered no immediate explanation. It was modest, sparsely furnished, and orderly. There were no obvious signs of prolonged activity involving another person. What drew attention instead were the inconsistencies, items that did not align with a single adult's routine. clothing folded and stored rather than discarded. Children's items placed carefully out of sight, not hidden, but not displayed either. Among those items was the gray knit hat. It was similar in size and material to the one Noah Bennett had been wearing on the afternoon he disappeared. Similarity alone did not establish origin. Many such hats existed. What mattered was context. Vaughn could not offer a consistent explanation for why it was there. His answers shifted, first suggesting it had been left behind by a child he had met, then stating he could not remember where it came from at all. Additional materials were recovered. Photographs stored in envelopes rather than albums, notes with dates and locations written without explanation. Receipts from fuel stops and roadside businesses that placed Vaughn within the same general area as Maple Grove Park during the weeks following Noah's disappearance. None of these elements provided a single answer. Together, they formed a pattern that demanded further attention. At the same time, Mercer returned again to the Bennett file. Witness statements were reviewed in light of the expanded scope. The woman who had mentioned a man in festive clothing near the park's side entrance was interviewed once more. This time, she recalled that the man had not been walking aimlessly. He had been standing near the trees, close to the service road, as if waiting rather than passing through. She could not say how long he had been there, only that the image had lingered with her. The maintenance worker's recollection of the unfamiliar vehicle was also revisited. With the knowledge of Vaughn's motorcycle and its side-mounted compartment, the placement of the vehicle along the service road took on clearer meaning. It had been positioned to leave without needing to turn around. That detail, minor on its own, aligned with the broader sequence now under review. Vaughn was questioned again, this time with greater structure. The earlier interview, conducted while he was impaired, had been marked by looseness. This session was different. He was alert, cautious, and selective in his responses. He did not volunteer information. He did not repeat the details that had first drawn attention. When asked directly about Noah Bennett, he denied knowing the name. When asked about Maple Grove Park, he stated he had no reason to be there. The contrast between his two accounts was documented carefully. No emphasis was placed on contradiction. The focus remained on what had been said freely versus what was now withheld. Investigators noted that Vaughn's reluctance increased when questions turned toward specific dates and locations. His answers grew shorter, his pauses longer. Meanwhile, communication with the Bennett family remained measured. Helen and Richard were informed that the review had entered a new phase. They were not given details. Mercer understood the cost of expectation, especially when certainty had not yet been established. Helen listened quietly, asking few questions. Richard nodded, his expression steady, as if absorbing information rather than reacting to it. Legal review followed. The material gathered was evaluated not for narrative strength, but for sufficiency. Each piece was considered in isolation and then as part of a whole. The goal was not to tell a story, but to support a conclusion that could withstand scrutiny. Where gaps remained, they were acknowledged rather than filled. As the process moved forward, one point became clear. The disappearance of Noah Bennett could no longer be described as unexplained in the same way it had been 38 days earlier. The evidence did not speak loudly, but it spoke consistently. Vaughn's movements, behavior, and unguarded statements formed a framework that placed him within reach of the moment Noah vanished. Formal steps were taken. Charges related to Vaughn's conduct on December 18th proceeded independently. The matter concerning Noah Bennett was addressed as a separate but connected record. The distinction mattered. Each case required its own foundation. In the weeks that followed, the work shifted from discovery to presentation. Reports were finalized. Statements were aligned with timelines. The sequence that had once been fractured now carried shape. It was not complete in every detail, but it was coherent. For Mercer, the case reached a point where further waiting would no longer serve clarity. The review had reached its limit. What remained was the responsibility to move forward, not with speculation, but with what could be stated with certainty. The silence that had followed Noah Bennett's disappearance had not ended with a sudden revelation. It had been narrowed, pressed inward by careful attention and restrained judgment. What had begun as absence was now framed by fact. And with that shift, the case entered its final phase, where answers, however incomplete, would no longer remain unspoken. The moment when Noah Bennett was brought back into the open did not arrive with raised voices or hurried movement. It came quietly, following days of procedural steps and careful confirmation. There was no announcement made in advance. No expectation was set. When Helen and Richard were asked to come in, they were not told what to prepare for. They were only told that the review had reached a point where their presence was necessary. The room where they waited was plain and evenly lit. Helen sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture unchanged from countless other meetings she had attended over the previous weeks. Richard stood near the window, looking out without focusing on anything in particular. Neither spoke much. Words by that point had lost their usefulness. When Noah was finally brought into view, it took a moment for recognition to settle. He appeared smaller than Helen remembered, thinner, his movements slower. He did not run forward. He stood where he was placed, holding the edge of his sleeve, his eyes scanning the room with cautious familiarity. The gray knit hat was back on his head, pulled low, just as it had been on the afternoon he disappeared. Helen did not cry out. She stood and walked toward him, stopping a step away, as if giving him time to decide. Noah looked at her, then at Richard, and then back again. The recognition came not as a sudden release, but as a gradual return. He reached out with one hand. Helen took it, gently, as if afraid that too much movement might disrupt the moment. Richard knelt beside them, placing a hand on Noah's shoulder, steady and certain. He did not speak at first. He checked his son's face, his arms, the familiar markers that confirmed this was real. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. The reunion did not unfold as a scene of relief. It unfolded as confirmation. Helen held Noah close, not tightly, but firmly enough to feel his presence. She spoke to him in short, calm sentences, telling him they were going home. Noah did not respond immediately. He leaned into her, resting his head against her shoulder, the way he used to when tired. Afterward, the details were handled with care. Medical checks were completed. Questions were asked slowly, spaced out over time, rather than gathered all at once. Noah spoke when he was ready. His words were few. He mentioned rides. He mentioned sitting quietly. He mentioned a man who wore bright clothing and talked a lot. Nothing was forced beyond that. For the Bennett family, the days that followed were shaped by adjustment rather than celebration. Noah returned home, not to applause, but to familiarity. His room was exactly as it had been left. His toys were where he expected them to be. The lamp in the hallway was finally turned off at night. Helen sat beside him until he fell asleep, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Richard resumed his routine, though he moved more slowly now, as if aware of each moment's weight. In the legal process that followed, Edgar Vaughn was held accountable for what could be established. The record reflected his actions, his statements, and the evidence gathered. The case did not rely on spectacle. It relied on sequence. The disappearance of Noah Bennett was no longer an open question. It had an explanation grounded in fact, even if not every detail could be fully articulated. For Inspector Paul Mercer, Closing the file brought neither satisfaction nor relief. He documented the final entries with the same handwriting he had used from the beginning. The work had not been about uncovering a dramatic truth. It had been about patience, about allowing fragments to align without forcing them into shape. The community of Riverton absorbed the outcome quietly. Conversations resumed. Maple Grove Park remained open. Parents watched their children with a little more attention, though most could not say exactly why. The image of festive clothing and familiar smiles took on a different meaning, not one of fear, but of awareness. Helen kept the gray knit hat folded in a drawer rather than on a hook. It had become something else now, no longer just a habit, but a reminder. Richard returned to Maple Grove Park one afternoon, standing near the bench where Noah had last been seen. He did not stay long. The place no longer held a question for him, only memory. The case answered what had happened. It did not answer why, and perhaps that was the limit of what could be expected. Some truths arrive fully formed. Others come in parts, enough to restore what was lost, but not enough to explain the space it left behind. As Riverton moved forward, the story of Noah Bennett settled into the city's quiet history. Not as a cautionary tale, and not as a symbol, but as a reminder that ordinary places can change without warning, and that attention, when sustained, can bring someone back from silence. The larger question remained, unspoken but present. How many moments pass unnoticed, simply because nothing seems wrong at the time? That question did not belong to the case alone. It belonged to everyone who listened. If this story held your attention, consider subscribing to the channel for more carefully told cases like this one. You can leave a comment to share your thoughts, or pass this video along to someone who listens closely. Your support helps these stories continue to be told, slowly and with care.